He became the world's greatest sword saint, but always dreamed of becoming a mage. After dying with nothing but regret, he returns to the day his future was decided. This time, no family, no expectations, and no destiny will force a sword into his hands again. He's going to master the magic he always longed for. Can the strongest swordsman in history become an even greater mage, even if the whole world stands in his way? Monsters are the enemies of humanity, devouring their civilization. Two paths open to those who challenge this monster. Mages, using mana in the air and performing unknown miracles, tried to fight the monsters and attack them with their magical powers, but the monster roared in response and attacked immediately. The mages screamed in horror and fear. Damn it, the monster rose above them. They tempered their bodies and used supernatural techniques, but there was only one path to choose. The monster spread all its magical power and created a bright flame. Perhaps this path would overwhelm them with despair, and at that moment, the people didn't know what to do. A bright flash spread everywhere, but suddenly Oscar decided to help them and rushed to attack the monster itself. The dragon was surprised by this when he saw Oscar's outline in his eyes and was frightened, and a moment later, the creature was cut in two. Or maybe they will reach the end and become heroes. At that moment, everyone started shouting, "Mr. Oscar, he is the Holy Sword." They couldn't believe he'd gotten here so quickly. Thank him for saving them. Oscar replied that the rest was up to them and left silently. The people rejoiced at being saved. He chose the path of the sword over magic, and having become the strongest of the swordsmen, earned the title of Holy Sword. When he heard someone say how beautiful it was, he turned around. The guy was showing the girl magic and saying, "This is called magic, little miss." When he saw this magic, he was dumbfounded. He became someone others looked up to, and yet, as a child, he was drawn to magic. He was very happy when he felt it, and this craving hasn't subsided to this day. He continued to train with his sword on the field. Two guys watched him, discussing how the master trained every morning. He never missed his training, and when the mentor first began his training, this was a wasteland. But due to his daily training, the ground gradually began to subside, forming a crater. The student was very surprised by this and opened his mouth in astonishment, after which he swallowed in surprise, and the guy asked, "By the way, what's he got there?" He remembered holding the envelope in his hands and shouted, "Yes, master." He had received a letter from the capital. He ran up and handed it to him, and Oscar read it and remained silent. He asked, "Is there something bad in there?" He replied that they wanted to award him a medal for slaying a dragon. God, I hope they'd think twice before calling him on any occasion. Kix scratched his head and replied that only he could say that. With his complicated record, he could apply for any position in the central government. He doesn't want to get involved in faction wars, and you can't really practice there. He was dumbfounded when he saw his hands and said that the master truly loved fencing. Oscar replied that he wouldn't say that and smiled. He chose the path of the sword because his father, a swordsman, told him to. The student was greatly surprised by his confession, and Oscar confirmed in his own mind that he had not chosen the path of the sword of his own free will. However, Kix still said he envied him. He clearly had a talent for fencing. He chose to become a swordsman himself, but lately he's been afraid. What if the sword isn't for him and he'll never become a mage? Mages draw power by channeling mana or energy through the channels that run through their bodies. But mana has less energy. These are two opposing forces, and if an air bubble gets into the blood vessels, it can kill a person. If mana is channeled through the channel through which the energy came, the body won't withstand it, and vice versa. The body will begin to deteriorate. That is why the choice between sword and magic will greatly affect the future. The protagonist placed a hand on his shoulder and told him that if something is bothering him, he should train, and before he knows it, he'll become stronger than him. Kix was embarrassed and delighted by this. After a while, Oscar lay in his bed and realized he'd poured out his heart to his student. He should have kept his mouth shut. He'd said he clearly had a talent for fencing, and Oscar looked at his hands and asked, what if he had a talent for magic? If something was bothering him, he should train. At that moment, he heard voices, and it turned out there had been an explosion nearby. The house began to burn with bright flames, and magic gathered around it. One of the mages raised his staff, and another asked if he'd succeeded. He replied that their enemy was a master swordsman, and they couldn't waste time. Suddenly, they were stunned by the loud bang they heard. As Oscar burst from the house, the mages were clearly professionals, and this was their leader. They began to fight him and used their magical powers to create fire. Oscar frowned and tried to avoid the attack, but suddenly turned right at the most senior mage among them and lunged at him with his sword. He was dumbfounded, and the mage asked, seeing Kix as a hostage, if perhaps he should let go of his sword, otherwise someone might get hurt. Kix, with tears in his eyes, shook with fear, and Oscar asked what they wanted from him. He replied that it was obvious. They wanted his life. He replied that he didn't remember ever causing anyone problems with his existence. The mage laughed and asked again, he doesn't remember? Nothing unexpected here, but they know no forgiveness. Not only the swordsman, but also the mage. He must blame his hidden potential for everything. Oscar asked again, what was he talking about now? The mage replied that he was going to die here anyway, so he didn't need to know. At that moment, he raised his staff, and Kix shouted to the master not to worry about him. He was ready to die. Oscar replied that this was clear, when suddenly the mage froze and looked at him questioningly. Oscar replied that he was indeed right. It was just a pity their calculations hadn't come to fruition. His student should not be underestimated. At that moment, the mage decided to act and, pointing his staff at him, shouted forward. Numerous bright beams of light rushed straight towards Oscar, and a moment later, there was a flash of light, followed by a large amount of dust. The mage waited, when suddenly he saw that many of his subordinates were killed. Kix broke free from his shackles, and Oscar stood there while blood dripped from his body, uttering that he didn't care about himself at all. He said that he didn't understand these swordsmen at all, and at that moment Kix ran up to him and started shouting, "Master!" He replied that they had achieved their goal, so they say goodbye. This is a holy sword with a talent for magic. Kix ran up to him, and Oscar asked if he was injured. Kix was worried about him, because he was bleeding all over, and shouted that his wounds were pouring out blood. What should he do? Oscar replied that he too was a swordsman and smiled, so he was prepared for death. Kix began to scream in horror and apologized to his master. Oscar asked him not to worry, as it was not his fault. Kix couldn't stop his tears, and Oscar realized that if he were a mage, he could do something similar. At that moment, he realized that he had always wanted to become a mage and continued swinging his sword to push those thoughts away. He clenched his fist and realized that he had been proud when people looked at him with admiration, and yet the delight he had felt then evaporated. Suddenly he found himself in another space filled with trees and leaves, and was surprised because he had died. When the protagonist looked around, he was very surprised. This was his village. This was Oscar's homeland, the village of Eisen. He had definitely died then, but what was happening now? A sword and several letters lay near him, which made him wonder, what are these? Oscar realized it was an invitation to 2 academies. In his country, young men receive 2 letters before their 15th birthday. This was an invitation to a magic academy and a sword academy. Candidates choose their own path, and then they must report to their chosen academy with the invitation. Had he really returned to the past? It seemed he was now only 14, and had not yet embarked on the path of the sword. At that moment, he stood up and saw an ominous man who asked what he was doing here. Oscar. It was his father, and Oscar jumped up, unsure how to react. Surely, if he had returned to the past, his father was still alive. And his father had said that lately he had begun to neglect his training. Did he think he no longer needed it? Oscar lowered his gaze and realized that was not the case at all. At that moment, he was debating whether to tell his father that he wanted to become a mage. His father was a swordsman and had many students, and as his son, he naturally also learned fencing from him. His father praised him for his success, but when he mentioned magic and how much he loved it because everything sparkled, he grabbed his hands and asked him to listen, saying that magic was a path for the weak. He was his son, and he needed nothing but a sword. Oscar was frightened by him then, and from then on, he continued to study fencing so that his father wouldn't be disappointed in him. He was drawn to magic, but he was attached to the sword, and in that moment, he remembered his death. Oscar realized he had had enough. This time, he would follow the path of his own choosing. He looked ahead confidently, and his father asked if he had anything to say about why he was skipping training. Oscar replied that he'd been wielding a sword since he was a child, and his father tensed up and asked again, "What?" At that moment, a multitude of magical swords appeared around him, and a strong, bright wind emerged. The surrounding swordsmen tried to shield themselves from the wind, and Oscar looked into his father's eyes, and those around him didn't understand why he was standing there, as if nothing had happened. Oscar felt nothing, and his father silently looked at him and said that, as far as he could see, he wasn't joking. He spread his arms, then placed his hand on his son's shoulder, and said that if he continued like this, he would be able to pass on his guild to him in the future. The boys didn't understand what this meant, and became angry. When his father turned away from him, Oscar thought about it. Suddenly, someone tapped him on the back. It was the Sinner boys who asked if he knew how they waited for the holidays to meet him. And now was a perfect chance, Oscar. They hadn't practiced fencing together in a long time. Oscar realized, by the way, that these were the same guys his father often put him in sparring matches with. After entering the academy, they had awakened their mental energy and began to take out their grievances on him, calling it practice. He stopped in front of his opponent, who told him to prepare now. He had no sword energy right now, and this created a gap between them that skill alone couldn't fill. He turned abruptly and walked toward the river, causing the guy to wonder what he was thinking. Oscar replied, "Thank you for being with him all this time." The guy's mouth dropped open in shock, and at that moment, Oscar threw his sword straight into the water. The guys started shouting. He threw his sword away. Is this a weakling trying to run away? They began laughing at him and bullying him, shouting that only a coward would refuse battle and show his back, and that he was shameful to be called a swordsman. At that moment, he ran straight at him and said he would no longer fight with a sword, but would become a mage. He turned around, smiled, and looked the guys in the eyes. At that moment, his opponent decided to attack him, shouting that just because he didn't have a sword didn't mean he'd give in. He used his powers, and Oscar thought about how sword energy could strengthen muscles, but at that moment he simply kicked him and said that was bad. A sword should be an extension of the hand, not just a tool. The guy shouted at him not to underestimate him and continued swinging his sword, causing Oscar to think, damn. For a second, he thought he was training his student. His opponent didn't understand. Why wasn't he hitting? He kept trying, but Oscar easily dodged each attack and suddenly decided to attack him in such a way that the sword was thrown aside. The boy exclaimed that he was simply a freak, and Oscar became so enraged that he swung his fist at him. He then asked what he would do without a sword against an unarmed man. After that, the boys, smiling, walked away, dragging their friend in their arms as he was exhausted. Oscar exhaled and realized they wouldn't bother him anymore. In his past life, he would have followed his father's lead and awakened the sword's energy. To prevent this from happening again, he needed to awaken Mana himself. He walked alone through the forest and suddenly became very tired. Beads of sweat began to pour off him, and he realized no one would see him here. He recalled a conversation from his past, asking a girl how she controlled magic. Swordsmen use internal energy to strengthen their bodies and weapons, and he wondered how this worked for mages. The girl replied that everything was clear, looked toward the filled jug of water, and picked it up, saying that for them, magic was somewhat similar to a watering can used to water plants. He was surprised. With a watering can, mana is invisible, but it always surrounds them. They channel it through their internal channels and give it form, after which the spell is activated. This is how sorcery is created. The protagonist sat on a large stone in the lotus position and pondered this. He remembered what she said about it surrounding them everywhere. If he could see mana, maybe he could channel it into his body. Hearing, sight, and other senses are necessary for survival in dangerous situations. He was no longer a swordsman, but this remained with him. If so, perhaps he could sense the invisible mana. At that moment, he closed his eyes and felt something incredible, causing everything in his soul to sparkle. When he opened his eyes, he realized it was mana. His mouth dropped open in amazement, and he cried out that he had succeeded. All that remained was to channel it into the channels. But at that moment, he was dumbfounded and didn't know how to do that. Oscar sensed something was wrong and jumped off the rock, realizing something was wrong. He approached the bushes where he heard a rustling sound and realized it was strange, as there were no signs of life there. Suddenly, an explosion occurred right next to him, throwing him aside and realizing it was a golem. This creature appeared right in front of him, and Oscar didn't understand what it was doing there. He tensed and suddenly saw someone jumping from above, directly in his direction. It was a girl who landed next to him and asked what he wanted from her creation. Did he want the research results? Oscar was surprised by this, and she continued to say that if he valued his life, she advised him to think twice before starting to speak. She was the talk of many battlefields. She could mainly be seen in the northern region, where snow and cold were commonplace. This is a heroine who controls an army of powerful golems fighting against a horde of monsters. This is the mage creator Isabel. Oscar didn't expect to meet her like this, so she leashed him. Isabel sat on her throne and asked, "Now let him tell which faction he belongs to?" Otherwise, she created a magic circle around him, and Oscar asked her to wait. He wasn't her enemy. After all, he even came with her voluntarily. She replied that she could see he wanted to die. Isabel rose from her seat and directed her magical powers at him, telling him to say goodbye to his life, the nameless mage. He gritted his teeth in anger and shouted that he wasn't even a mage, which left her dumbfounded. She replied that it was another excuse and grabbed his head, when suddenly she felt an incredible force and froze. She was surprised that there was no mana in his veins. After some time, Isabel said that she more or less understood his story and would say right away that she would not apologize for what happened. She'd only just been accepted into the academy as a professor, and everyone was already looking down on her. Oscar was surprised and asked, "Does she teach at the Magic Academy?" Isabel exhaled and answered correctly, "She hopes to advance golem research." Oscar realized this was his chance. If he became her apprentice, he'd learn to absorb mana. At that moment, Oscar said, "Mistress Isabel, can she teach him how to absorb mana from the environment?" Isabel answered without thinking, "No, she's not interested in weaklings. If he understood everything, then let him finish his tea and leave." Oscar considered this. No, he can't back out now. Isabel asked for more tea, and he wondered if this could really be a golem assistant. When he looked at this creature, he felt incredible strength and, standing up, said that something seemed off about this golem. And Isabel asked, "What? Is this how he tries to interest her?" At that moment, the golem spilled tea right on her head, and Oscar exclaimed, "Miss Isabel, she didn't burn herself. Is she all right? Here, let her get a napkin." Isabel was very surprised. Turning to look at the golem, she felt a break in the chain near right shoulder. She grabbed his hand and screamed. How did he know the golem was broken? Oscar replied that the flow of mana inside this creature seemed strange to him. She thanked him for it and asked if he could see the mana flow. He remembered how the girl had said that mana was invisible and answered yes. And now she understood why the barrier had cracked. The barrier was blocking mana in the atmosphere. Maybe it's because of his past life experiences, or because of that very potential? Without thinking twice, Isabel turned to Oscar and said, "Listen, she'll teach him magic," and smiled. He was surprised and asked, "Really?" But she did say it. But before he could finish, Isabel said she wasn't interested in weaklings, but he was interested right now. She offered him her hand with a smile, and he shyly shook it. After a while, they began training. Two golems stood and held a board where Isabel drew everything she needed with chalk. It seemed he had the wrong idea about mana. Living organisms absorb it unconsciously. Oscar asked, then how should he channel it into his channels? She replied that to pour tea, he needed a cup. Mana could be channeled into the channels using a magical formula. He was surprised and asked again, "A formula?" She said it was a magical paper with a spell drawn on it, the same kind they give out at the academy at the very beginning. He shouted, "A spell? What kind of spell is that?" Isabel replied that he would know about it when he activated it. Let him imagine the power permeating his entire body and direct this formula. Can he handle it? Oscar shouted confidently, "Yes, he'll try." Isabel mused that it seemed simple, but it would take at least a month to succeed. Although if he truly had talent, maybe half a month would be enough. He extended his hand and thought about what he needed to feel the power calling his body. That's right, something similar happened during sword training. He needed to focus on his sensations. He smiled and closed his eyes, then found himself in a certain space and the magical seal glowed with a bright light. He realized that it was true. Mana was already within him. Everything around him lit up with a bright light, and a wind appeared from the surge of power. Learning magic is like learning to walk again. No one is born with this skill. Time after time, they learn and develop until they can stand firmly on their own 2 feet. When Isabel saw this, she was dumbfounded. People say that in the world of magic, the higher their status, the faster a person masters magical skills. And at that moment, the protagonist watched as bright bursts of magic appeared right in front of him, and Isabel couldn't believe it. He'd succeeded on the first try. At that moment, she recalled the situation with the golem when she'd asked him how he'd figured it out, and wondered if it was because he could see mana. Although no, that alone wouldn't be enough, but one thing was certain, he was a true genius. Oscar realized it was magic, and she started screaming. It was simply amazing. He'd managed to activate the formula on the first try. No one had ever managed that before. He said no, and at that moment she asked, "What is it?" He replied that it was ugly, since he'd seen it in action once. For him, magic is something beautiful and special, but this isn't that kind of magic. She was dumbfounded and looked at him in surprise, after which Oscar continued to say that this part of the formula, something here, was wrong, just like with the golem's magic circuit. Isabel, what does she think about this? She was in shock and couldn't say anything coherent, so Oscar said he understood everything. He clenched his fist and realized he didn't want to be just a mage. He wanted to use perfect and beautiful magic. At that moment, Isabel, stunned, replied that if the formula bothered him so much, he could simply rewrite it. He was surprised and asked again, how should he do that? He needed to draw out the magic formulas. Sometime later, his father passed through the hallway and overheard his students discussing how he had become so strong, and what should they do now. He approached him and asked what had happened. The boys were frightened and didn't know what to answer, saying nothing serious had happened. Brian decided to repeat the question. What had happened? The boys were even more frightened and replied that something had actually happened. When they told him everything, Brian was dumbfounded and couldn't believe Oscar had defeated them. He understood everything. Let them take care of him so that injuries wouldn't interfere with tomorrow's training. At that moment, the guys shouted, yes. He realized that it seemed the time had come. It was time for him to master the energy of the sword. Brian smiled, proud of his son. After some time, the protagonist found himself in Isabel's office among many books. He hadn't thought that magic formulas were such a complicated thing. To use magic, he needed knowledge, but it wasn't that bad. She lent him her books so he could learn more. Oscar asked again, is she sure about this? She replied, yes, all her knowledge is here. Let him take as much as he wants. At that moment, she saw him disappear from the spot and asked again, what? He was already behind her with a pile of books and said, Miss Isabel, he will take these books. She asked, will he steal it all? He replied that she said he could take as much as he wanted. Isabel was surprised and said she understood everything. He was full of enthusiasm now, but she needed to give him advice. He was a mage now, and mana flowed through the channels in his body. He should be careful and not use the sword's energy, otherwise everything would go wrong and he would simply die. Oscar remembered how he had once ridden a horse in the village and came to visit his ailing old father. He said they hadn't seen each other for a long time while he lay in his bed. When Oscar approached him, his father asked him to come closer and grabbed his shoulder, saying that he had always known he had talent. It was no wonder he had convinced him to give up magic. At that moment, the protagonist recalled all this with horror and accepted the blue letter. He thought, Father, this time he will go to the Magic Academy. Sometime later, Brian was near the fire and asked if he had something to ask him. Oscar said he wanted him to sign his invitation to the academy. He asked again, but why so suddenly? There was still time. At that moment, he realized he was referring to the Magic Academy, and Oscar, with a smile, said everything was fine with him, but he couldn't enroll without his signature. He asked, Oscar, why magic? He was his son after all, and had learned to wield a sword there since childhood. Oscar replied, does he remember how he talked about wanting to become a mage? His father threw the letter away and said that those were just childhood fantasies. And Oscar asked again, fantasies? His father wanted to push him by the chest, and Oscar said that he thought that's how everyone looked to him. And at that moment, he parried his attack with his magic, which almost burned his father, and asked, what kind of joke is this? Has he already awakened mana? Oscar replied that he decided that this was the only way to convince him of this. And Brian asked again, what is he trying to convince him of? He heard that he single-handedly defeated older students without having any energy. Does he even understand his talent? Oscar replied, yes, he understands everything. And Brian started shouting, no, he doesn't understand. He should listen. As a swordsman, he could reach unprecedented heights. And Oscar replied that perhaps he was right, father, but that didn't mean he could be happy. He recalled his past, and a silence fell between them, after which Brian grabbed his face and said clearly he understood everything. Perhaps they still had a chance to fix everything, and he looked at his son in horror. Oscar replied that he had already forgotten what happens when mana and sword energy collide. Brian asked again, he could die. right? Well, what else could he do? If he decided to follow the wrong path, then it was his duty to beat the soul out of him so that he realized his mistake. He drew his sword and said that he might not understand it now, but in the future, he would be grateful. Oscar thought that this would never happen and recalled his entire past, realizing that it never happened. Brian told him to take the sword, and Oscar was surprised by this. Brian decided to wait for him, and when Oscar thought about it, he said, "Father, hasn't he forgotten that he's a mage?" He pulled out a letter with a red seal and threw it into the fire. When Brian saw this, he shouted the same thing, and Oscar said that now they would see who would correct whom, Master Swordsman Brian. At that moment, Brian decided to see what he was talking about. He shouldn't be arrogant just because he could withstand the pressure of his sword. At that moment, he immediately dodged his father's attack, which left him dumbfounded. Attacks using sword energy are all predictable. He remembered his past as a child and watched his father's actions. At that moment, Brian made a few more moves, but Oscar easily avoided them all. As a swordsman, he always looked up to his father. Brian said that these weren't empty words. He was able to dodge all the attacks even without sword energy, and it was unlikely that anyone else in the guild could do that. He has real talent with the sword. In the future, he could even achieve the impossible. Let him feed his sword energy now. Oscar replied that he thought he'd said he'd beat the crap out of him and had switched to negotiations because nothing had worked. He smiled, and Brian called him a fool, after which Oscar said that as a father, talent was valued above all else, but he had something he couldn't give up. Brian asked again, "What is it, a sword?" Oscar showed him the staff and said that it was true for beginners, but the lady and Isabel had said that using magic required knowledge. He lacked knowledge yet, but the same could be said. What would he do next? He couldn't predict that. At that moment, the father rushed straight at his son, but he managed to anticipate all his moves and turn back. A struggle began between them, and ever since he first saw magic, it began to appear in his dreams. The magic he always dreamed of was the spark fireworks. At that moment, Brian was dumbfounded by what he saw and backed away. He grabbed his head and realized it was magic. Did he want to blind him? Oscar said no, and at that moment, he tossed his sword aside. As the sword fell, Oscar replied that he knew he would swing as soon as he sensed his presence. Brian said the spell was a distraction, trying to disarm him. The protagonist told him not to show his true intentions to the enemy. That's how he taught him. Brian became very angry and said he personally vouched for his talent with the sword, but what guarantee was there that the path of magic wouldn't be a dead end for him? Oscar replied that he simply wanted to follow the path of his own choosing. Father, did he choose the sword because someone told him he had talent for it? At that moment, his father looked down and remembered how his parents had discussed whether they should teach his child the sword or magic. His father replied that he thought since it was his child, he should take up the sword. His mother had asked, didn't he choose the sword because he thought it looked cooler? They shouldn't choose it for him. It was his path, and he had to make the choice himself. At that moment, Brian smiled and said that he thought that with time, he would even be able to achieve the rank of a sword saint. But at that moment, he simply walked past him and asked what happened. He picked up the document from the floor, and Oscar tensed as he watched. Brian said he couldn't sign it and smiled. After a while, one of the Magic Corps workers examined the incoming students' documents and remarked that it looked like there were many interesting first-year students this year. The girl listed them: the daughter of the Norton family, the son of the Glory House, and even Her Highness. They had already mastered the basic paperwork and were beginning to learn family spells. At that moment, the professor entered and asked if something was wrong. Blood close to the flowers is true luck. Oscar continued studying and read many books. Sometime later, in front of the guild building, Brian looked at his son and said that 6 months had flown by so quickly. There would be many at the academy who had studied magic since childhood. He knew he had no right to say so, but since he had chosen this path, he would never deviate from it. He replied that everything would be fine. He was unlikely to meet anyone there more terrifying than his father. Brian smiled and replied, "I understand." After these words, Oscar announced that it was time for him to go and turned around. He held the signed letter in his hands and thought about how he had finally achieved his dream. He would finally be able to get into the Magic Academy. When he arrived at that very magic palace, he saw a multitude of mages, gnomes, and witches flying around on brooms. The Keurig Empire Magic Academy turned his head. It was completely different from the Sword Academy. These creatures are similar to golems, but still different. How do they work? At that moment, Miss Isabel approached him and said that if he stopped at every interesting thing, he would be late for enrollment. He was surprised when he heard her voice, and she asked if he had been lazing around while she was gone. He replied, "Of course not." He had learned a lot in these 6 months. She replied that she couldn't wait to see it all and was sure he would surprise her again. By the way, shouldn't they go there? As far as she knew, the selection exam for first grade was held there. The protagonist asked again, "A selection exam?" Isabel explained that first years are divided into 2 classes: those who have already awakened magic and those who haven't. There's also a special class for the most outstanding students. This is the true first class. You can get into this class by passing an exam. But she wouldn't advise him to participate. He exclaimed, "But why? She explained that all first-class students possess monstrous power, not the elite, people who have been surrounded by magic since infancy. Besides, before she could finish, Oscar suddenly jumped out and shouted that he could study advanced magic there. He really liked the idea, and Isabel scratched her head and replied that it seemed pointless explaining all this to him. If he was so curious, he should see for himself. People gathered around the duel field to watch the battle unfold. There, an exam was taking place between two people who had begun demonstrating their magical powers. A moment later, the boy was delighted that he had succeeded and shouted about it. Oscar, watching the proceedings, realized that the point of the exam was apparently to hit these targets. But why did he feel like he was being watched? At that moment, an unknown person approached him and said that commoners like him were not welcome. It was a guy named Zazan. He should leave immediately. Oscar replied that he had heard that any willing first year could participate in the exam. Zazan chuckled and said that he seemed to be good at talking. So that's what Miss Isabel was trying to say. All first-class students possessed monstrous strength, not the elite. And in this class, those who weren't from noble families didn't complain. Zazan moved him aside and said that he would be next, and he should stand and watch. When he moved him aside, he brought him a fine for using his magical powers and smiled. First class was only for those who dedicated their lives to magic. He should understand the difference between them, and let everything freeze now. He used the Mega Glacier High Freeze spell, and everything around him turned to ice. The surrounding guys were astonished by such power, as was Oscar, who was stunned. They started screaming, "This is ice from Glory's house," and he hadn't cast it at full power. Now he could see everything. "Those who don't know high magic spells have no place here." Oscar replied, "Yes, the spell is amazing. It's obvious it's been honed for years. But that's not it." At that moment, Zazan got angry and asked, "What does that mean?" Oscar stepped onto the field and realized he knew exactly how those who put all their time into training felt. He was worried about getting into first grade. Oscar said he was grateful. He had regained his confidence. He smiled and decided to begin the fight. The surrounding guys laughed at him and urged each other to look at his wand. "This is for beginners." What did he expect with such a wand? Zazan couldn't understand where he got his confidence from. After all, his spell was perfect. Oscar approached the block of ice, and Zazan thought that he was the ice of House Gloris, and his ice magic couldn't possibly be flawless. Why did his words even bother him? At that moment, the event host lowered the list and realized that this year there were many outstanding candidates. It wasn't every year that people could use magic of this level, and Zazan was likely to be the best among the entire first-year mages. But she couldn't understand one thing. What was he trying to achieve by stalling for time? The protagonist raised his wand and waited. People shouted at him to just give up. He wouldn't hit his target anyway. Oscar ignored them, and the professor thought, "No, wait, he's not worried at all. He seems to be waiting for something." At that moment, Oscar suddenly tensed and used his magical powers. When the host suddenly turned to him, her mouth open in shock. He used a pyrosphere fireball. At that moment, he slammed the magic sphere directly into the ice block, destroying it a moment later. Everyone around him started wondering, was it her imagination, or did he hit all of the targets? Was that a basic spell? But the holes were so small, she could see 2 of them. The guys shouted that he was a loser. If he really wanted to go to the academy, he should have learned something useful. Zazan wondered what spell he was using, and realized it was a waste of time. But at that moment, the host didn't know how to react, and Oscar asked, "Did he fail?" She screamed, "No, he hit all 5 targets. Of course he advanced." But she didn't understand. If he had such good magic control, then why did he destroy 5 targets at once instead of shooting 1 at a time? Then no one would have been able to say it was just an accident. Oscar looked down, musing that his spell was amazing, but he still felt like such spells were a waste of mana. "That's all?" The girl asked again. "A waste of mana?" This test was meant to simulate a real counter against monsters, so he thought it would be more practical to use the method with the lowest mana cost. The girl realized what he meant and replied that everything was clear now and that he should forgive her for asking a stupid question. Excellent vision, able to read targets, movements, and wait for the right moment. He had excellent control over the spell's direction, and the spell he had chosen couldn't be called flashy or complex. But unlike others, it was amazing. Oscar walked through the grounds of his new university, smiling, musing that the professor had managed to make the targets move independently of each other, and that it was only his first day, and he had already met so many amazing mages. He was very happy and proud of himself, when suddenly he sensed something was wrong and asked, "Who is it?" A mage appeared behind him, saying he'd been spotted and that he had keen eyes or good intuition. His name was Balsams, and he was the rector of this academy. When the protagonist saw him, he immediately bowed and apologized for his rudeness. Balsams told him not to apologize, because after all, he really had been secretly following him. He realized who it was. He remembered him from his past, and at that moment, Balsams asked, "What happened, Oscar?" He offered to shake hands. Oscar realized that the mage who killed him had the same pendant. He pulled out his hand and shook the rector's, but felt an ominous gaze on him. At that moment, a magical vortex appeared in front of him, and Oscar didn't know what to do. He quickly dodged, and yet he has a very keen eye. The rector kept up with him, and Oscar asked, "Have you come to kill him?" Balsams asked, "Does he think such a small wand can do anything to him?" He pointed his staff at him and said, "Storm prison in the seer sphere." When he used the spell, he realized it was a powerful wind barrier. He had nowhere to run, and then he should use his seal. He finished drawing it first on the ground and used fireball. Afterward, a bright beam of light reached the sky, and the principal was surprised by its power. He froze and parried the attack, but Oscar was surprised when it happened. The principal breathed a sigh of relief and quickly realized there was no way to defend against the spell. Therefore, he decided to eliminate the caster himself, and Oscar didn't know what to do or how to proceed. He crouched down, and the principal asked if he was exhausted. It was a dangerous move. He would be completely defenseless if he didn't kill the enemy on the first try. Oscar replied that it wasn't funny. Why was he testing him? Balsams replied that he understood everything. Many here consider magic a privilege and dislike outsiders. He wanted him to understand what the future might hold, but it seemed he had underestimated his potential. Oscar asked, so if he stands out too much, he'll become everyone's target. Balsams confirmed that was true, because there are those who don't believe that talent can simply come from people. At that moment, Oscar remembered his terrible words before his death, that they knew no forgiveness and that he should see his hidden potential in everything. He remembered his own potential and realized that the man had said something similar. At that moment, Oscar asked to tell him more about them. The rector paused and said that knowing their true identities would only put him in danger. For now, he should focus on cultivating his strength so he could protect himself. He wondered, protect himself? If he seriously intended to kill him, he would already be dead. He closed his eyes and suddenly noticed something was wrong. He turned his attention back to the pendant and asked, what is it? The rector replied that it was the sign of a saint. He showed it to him, and Oscar understood clearly. A holy mage is the highest rank, just like a holy sword. The rector decided it was time to give it to him, and he tossed the badge into his hand. Oscar caught it, and the rector told him not to lose it. He would need it later. After these words, he vanished, and Oscar realized it was a smooth flow of mana. Flawless. That's what the rector's magic looked like. But now was not the time to admire him. He thought that this time it would be enough to simply dedicate his life to studying magic, but he remembered his death. Among those who killed him was a holy mage, and there was a chance he would target him in this life. He clenched his fist and realized that he had to surpass his former self. After some time, the audience began discussing this guy as the first commoner to get into the first class. They began discussing the one who hit all the targets, and Zazan, listening to this, became angry. He called it idiotic, because those who don't take magic seriously will soon be weeded out anyway. At that moment, Oscar entered the room, and everyone turned their attention to him. Zazan became very angry and jumped up from his seat when he realized he was there. But he didn't understand what the hell was going on. Oscar ignored them and walked with a confident expression. He reflected on his last meeting with the rector and his words. He trained that night and generated mana around himself, musing that if running increases endurance, then repeatedly releasing mana allows one to expand the channels and increase the amount of mana absorbed. He thought about it and saw that dawn had already broken. The more mana he could absorb, the longer it would take to release it from his body, and now he needed real practice. He was very surprised when he looked at the time, quickly dressed, and realized that for the first time he wanted to get stronger. And at that moment, he entered the office, causing Zazan to tense up and bare his teeth at him. Oscar also noticed all the guys and realized that he was here after all. A girl sat behind him, reading a book. He picked up her bookmark that had fallen and said that it seemed to belong to her. She took it in her hands and thanked him for it. Oscar realized that she apparently really liked flowers and remembered Lily from the past, who looked at him in surprise. He sat down next to her and said nothing. He just thought the flowers on the bookmark were beautiful. His name was Oscar. Nice to meet you. She also said her name, Lily Lowell. At that moment, someone entered their office and said, it seemed like everyone was there. The guys jumped up and didn't understand whose voice that was. Where was it coming from? The pages suddenly started turning, and the guys didn't understand what kind of trick it was. Suddenly, the same professor came out to them, wishing everyone a good day and saying that her name was Rush. She was assigned to teach the first class. They all came for the selection tests and proved their talent. Oscar realized that she was conducting tests for admission to the first class, and Rush said that therefore, starting next week, they would learn how to fight monsters. This would be their practice. He smiled and realized that now there would really be combat experience, and so quickly. Rush said that they would work in groups of 5 to balance their strength. The guys were surprised. What do you mean magical power? She answered no. This time it was about their channels, or, in other words, how much mana they could absorb. The guys asked, how would she measure it? At that moment, Rush smiled and said that everything was ready. She created a magic circle above herself, and all the guys looked on in amazement. Each of them had a sphere above their heads. The brighter it glowed, the more mana they had. The guys exchanged glances and watched the color of each circle. Rush thought that some of them were already on par with experience papers in terms of level, and that was impressive. But as for him, Oscar didn't understand how the spell worked. All the guys noticed that his color was barely glowing and asked if he had really been accepted into the first class. After all, a commoner is a commoner. Those who would be in the same group with him would be out of luck. He decided that now was not the time for distraction, and at that moment, Lily turned to him and asked if he would like to work in the same group with her. He asked again, are you sure about that? She replied, yes, he likes flowers, so he's definitely a good person. But they still needed to ask Raven's permission. Oscar was surprised and asked, who is that? Raven asked again. Should we include him in the group? Oscar replied with a smile that if he didn't mind, he'd be grateful. There was a silence between them, and he said that protecting the weak was also a noble's duty, so fine, he'd carry their luggage. After a while, they went out into the hallway, and all the guys were turning to look at Oscar. Lily noticed this and told him to ignore them. Nobles study magic from childhood, and it was logical there would be a difference in knowledge. He replied, nothing, and thanked her for inviting him to the group. At that moment, Lily wondered, how long has he been studying magic? He replied that it had happened 6 months ago. He was lucky to have found a good teacher. Lily looked at him, stunned, and asked, only 6 months? Oscar turned around, not understanding what was wrong. When Rush left the office, Zazan addressed her by name and approached. She asked what had happened. Zazan wondered why commoners were allowed into the first class. He didn't really know any spells, and his mana was too low. A rookie like him clearly didn't belong in the first class. He was already falling behind, and the gap would soon become even more noticeable. Rush asked again, he's talking about Oscar? He'd awakened mana within his body 6 months ago, and he still thought he didn't belong here? At that moment, Zazan was stunned, and Rush continued to say that he would continue to grow quickly. Given a couple of months, he might prove himself very soon, and anyone with real skill would be weeded out during the actual practice. With that, she continued. Generally speaking, many nobles begin learning magic in childhood, and that's why most of them are now at the master level, if not higher. Oscar asked, so that's it? Magic masters are already quite capable of fighting real monsters, even if they have no combat experience. But reaching master level at such a young age is already an achievement. This was astonishing to him, and Lily shouted that the only amazing thing here was him, Oscar. In 6 months, he'd reached apprentice level, and it was mind-boggling. He silently wondered if this was really his talent. He just had a good mentor. She replied that it was still abnormal, and Oscar blurted out he had one more question. Who the hell is Raven? She replied that he was from a line of great aristocrats with a long history and tradition. His house had gathered around it smaller families who needed protection. Oscar asked what family she was from. She replied that Raven was certainly rude, but very strong and would definitely protect them when help was needed. The protagonist thought that this was his chance to gain real combat experience, and someone else's protection would only hinder him. After some time, everyone gathered in the forest, and Rush decided to explain the practice to them again. Low-ranking monsters roamed this forest, and their task was to spend one night there. Oscar reflected that first she conducted a test, and now the practice, and Rush explained that the team leaders had received magic sheets. If they activated the magic on the sheet, a protective barrier surrounded them, and a signal flare would be launched. If an emergency occurred, they must immediately activate the spell. It would be quite easy, and they could use the sheet if monsters attacked, that was all. However, those who used the sheet would be expelled from the first class. At that moment, all the guys were scared and didn't know how to react. Lily was also terrified and began to get nervous. Oscar realized that the atmosphere had changed dramatically. It was very important for the nobles to maintain their place in the first class. Raven said that as long as they were with him, no one would be expelled. His house was one of the most noble. He would protect them all. After some time, the guys got ready and talked among themselves. Raven tossed the bag to the protagonist and said that he would carry it. Lily exclaimed that it was too heavy, but Oscar said it was fine, since he had agreed to it in advance. He grinned because it was good that he knew his place. The main thing was that he keep up with them. Oscar picked up the bag and threw it on his back. After a while, Raven tired, and the guys began to ask if he was okay. Beads of sweat began to trickle down his face, and Oscar said that the ground here was uneven, so he got tired quickly from walking. Would he be able to get up? When he raised his hand, Raven became very angry and yelled at him to shut up right now. He was angry with him and didn't understand why he was still standing. Oscar really did have a lot of strength, and he wondered why they hadn't encountered a single monster yet. Maybe it was because they were so close to the academy. Suddenly, he saw a bright magical light and shouted for everyone to stop because they couldn't go any further. Raven screamed. Was he going to give him orders? He deliberately went further, and Oscar felt it was just like Isabel's protective barrier. Magic distorted space, and at that moment, the guys stepped into it and didn't understand what was happening. They all screamed in horror and fear, and Oscar told everyone to get their wands ready. A moment later, everything in front of them vanished, and Lily said that it seemed like this wasn't the forest they were walking through anymore. They saw a sign on a tree, and Lily shouted that this was the 5th training ground. The guys exclaimed in fear and started discussing how upperclassmen were training here. How did they even get here? Oscar was surprised because someone had set a trap. The situation was urgent, and wouldn't it be better to call for help? He remained silent and tore the paper right in front of him. The guys started shouting. What is he doing? He replied that they were exaggerating, that the academy had simply forgotten to erase the circle, and that this usually happened by accident. Oscar asked again, is that true? Raven replied that this was their chance. If they defeated the local creatures, the academy would highly value them. He decided to follow the guys who followed him, shouting that he was the heir of the Aldrich family for a reason. Lily asked Oscar not to stray too far from her, please. He was upset when he suddenly felt something was wrong. A multitude of wolf monsters appeared in front of them, baring their teeth, and Raven said it was just in time. The protagonist used his wand and thought that he was still a little nervous, but this was his chance to gain real combat experience. He wanted to try out a certain spell, and Raven shouted, "Why is he asking for trouble? Let him better stand aside and watch how the aristocrat fights." The protagonist became angry about this, and at that moment, Raven rushed into battle. He pulled out a huge stick and threw it straight at the monster. It was the earthen shield of the ancient Greek goddess of earth. When he struck the ground, numerous bright beams of light appeared around it, from which stones emerged and protected the guys. He shouted for everyone to act now, and their classmate used a wind spear, and another a water spear. When they combined their powers, they destroyed the first attacking wolf. Oscar wondered if there was both defense and offense here, dividing the roles. They covered each other's weak points. "Is this how aristocrats fight? No, this is how mages fight." Raven exclaimed that there were too many of them and cursed. The guys continued their attempts, but one of them missed, and the wolf slipped right through to them. Lily found herself in danger, and Raven turned around and cried out in anger when suddenly a wolf pounced right on her. She was startled, but at that moment, Oscar used a fire blade and protected her, standing right in front of her. He threw the wolf aside while the creature growled loudly, and she thanked him for the help. He said not to thank him, because it looked like they were already finished. When night fell, the guys found themselves around the campfire and discussed how they had both entered the forest, and he had already been able to observe a real battle. Yes, he was lucky. Oscar confirmed this and said that their team works very well together. But he himself needed to become stronger to be able to counter their magic. "Is this really the only way this training can be done?" Lily approached him and said, "Oscar." She asked him not to leave her side, but in the end, it was she who needed help. She served him tea, and Oscar said it was nothing to worry about. By the way, several defensive spells were used during that fight, but they seemed to vary in strength. "Why is that?" Raven replied that the closer the spell is to the mage, the more powerful it is. That's obvious. Lily asked him not to worry about it. The further the spell is from him, the faster the mana within it dissipates. He understood, so that's why his spell disappeared. If you invest too little mana, the spell won't activate, and the same spell will produce different results depending on the situation. There must be a way to increase its effectiveness. Then she mentioned that it was a little stronger than she expected, and Oscar smiled, suddenly realizing it. She didn't understand what had happened and asked, "Oscar?" He said he needed to channel more power into the vessel. It was somewhat similar to the energy of the sword. After some time, Iman created a magic ball to observe the guys, through which he could see everything that was happening. This incredible power of the son of the Aldrich house turned out to be more than just a rumor, but he wished he had behaved more restrainedly. After a while, the students gathered in a circle, and Rush stood next to them. The boys were cold and wrapped themselves in a blanket. She reflected on how their dropout rate was only 20%, which was a good result. At that moment, Isabel approached her and announced that it was her shift. Rush asked with a smile, "Is it time already?" The surrounding students realized who the woman was, and Isabel. She greeted the students and said they loved looking after the youngsters, but they weren't all that bad. That's why they were first class. Incidentally, she didn't see Oscar. Rush replied that it was actually just a recording. Professor Iman should know what was happening right now. At that moment, she noticed the fire and sensed something strange. She'd just been there. Meanwhile, the students were still around the fire, resting. Everyone was busy with their own affairs, and Oscar was staring into his cup, musing on how swordsmen concentrated the sword's energy within their bodies, thereby amplifying it. If he did the same with mana, then. But before he could fully consider this thought, he suddenly heard a loud scream. The guys were shouting that they needed to get out of here as quickly as possible, and Raven asked, "Did you catch another little thing? Okay, let them leave this to him." The guys continued to run, and at that moment, a bright fiery flame appeared behind them, causing everyone to become wary. Raven jumped up and didn't understand what it was. Lily said it was a stream of flame, and they were surprised. At that moment, a huge monster stepped straight towards them, and the guys exclaimed, "Is that a dragon?" Oscar was also stunned, and didn't expect such a turn of events. The monster pounced on the guys and began to roar, and Raven was surprised. But what was a dragon doing here? It was simply impossible. Only someone of Emperor level could kill something like that. Oscar realized what it meant. Someone was targeting them, and began to concentrate. The guys exclaimed, "Raven, they need to call for help quickly." He replied that he had long ago torn up the paper with the spell, and Lily asked what they should do. Oscar replied that they had no choice but to act, and the boys tensed. Lily asked fearfully, "Is he really going to fight the dragon?" He replied that it was the only way to survive, and the boys answered definitely. "Raven, he has protective spells. They just need to hold out until the teachers notice them." He tensed up and, swinging a huge wooden weapon, shouted, "Earth Shield, Gaia Shield." When he stuck it in the ground, a huge magical protective barrier appeared beneath him, which he built around himself and kept the boys out. They screamed in fear. What is he doing? He called them idiots and said that they would increase the load on the shield, and that way at least he could survive. The boys were terrified and repeated that he had said he would protect them, and they realized that Oscar was right. He had already noticed them, so running was useless, so they would fight. Lily used the Earth Spear Hecaton Share and struck the monster. The guys asked hopefully, did she succeed? It turned out nothing worked, and only higher magic would help. Lily shouted that she would distract the creature while they called for backup. At that moment, she noticed Oscar, who was confidently looking at the creature and moving straight toward it. The guys, tears in their eyes, held out their magic wands and tremblingly muttered that they didn't want to die. This was the end. When the monster opened its mouth, it released a huge fireball from its throat, and Lily looked at Oscar in surprise. She realized it was absorbing mana from the atmosphere and converting it into energy. That was it. Now they would see who was better. Oscar held out his magic wand and smiled. Dragons have been described as natural disasters since ancient times. By absorbing natural mana, they spew forth their fiery breath, earning dragons their nickname. What if they didn't just absorb mana, but concentrated it and strengthened it? At that moment, he did the impossible, and everyone was stunned with horror. They were dumbfounded by the main character's actions. Using a pyrosphere fireball, a bright bolt of lightning emerged from the ball, striking the monster directly in the throat and consuming it from the inside. A moment later, the monster fell to the ground, motionless in a pool of its own blood. The guys weren't expecting this turn of events, and Lily fell to the ground in terror. She couldn't react, and Oscar rolled up his sleeves and said nothing. At that moment, Emon, watching through the magic ball, muttered that this wasn't funny anymore. A newcomer had killed his chimera. Where did he get such power? He turned sharply and realized they were suspicious. This time he was saved, but he would definitely destroy it. Only those with noble blood in their veins had the right to wield such power. Oscar looked at his hands and smiled, realizing he had succeeded. He clenched his fist and trembled, because the energy amplification technique was now working on mana. If he hadn't had the experience of his past life, he would never have come up with this theory. At that moment, the monster was destroyed, and the guys were surprised. Did it really work? He really killed it? Frightened, Raven began rustling in his protective barrier and said that it was just nonsense. The commoner had protected him, not he him. Lily asked what happened. Oscar took a step and suddenly began to fall, which frightened Lily, and she decided to grab him. She asked if he was okay. Oscar answered yes. He was just a little tired. It seemed he overdid it and got a blowback. It felt like he was being torn apart from the inside. It was both painful and hot. Suddenly, a bright light appeared behind them, and all the guys turned to look. Lily clutched her staff to her chest and asked, "Who is that?" It turned out that Isabel had arrived. She reported that when she detected the circle's trace by teleportation, she realized something was wrong, and she was right. She arrived on her golem and asked if everyone was safe. The guys looked at her in shock, and Oscar said, "Miss Isabel," but suddenly he fell, exhausted and unconscious. She turned to look at the monster and realized what was happening. Clutching her head, she said they would discuss everything when they returned to the academy. The guys exchanged shocked glances, and dawn had already broken. Sometime later, Oscar found himself in Balsam's office, who said, "Who would have thought something like this could happen on academy grounds?" Oscar didn't answer, and Balsams blurted out that there were some arrogant people at the academy who were targeting a talented commoner. When he said this, Oscar froze and realized something. Balsam said it was amazing he'd survived. Oscar replied that he decided to become stronger, and it seemed he was already making progress. Balsams lowered his gaze and, walking to the window, said that given the damage the academy could suffer as its rector, he was forced to deliver some unpleasant news. Oscar looked at him questioningly, and Balsam said, "Oscar, he'll leave the academy and never use magic again." When Oscar heard this, he froze in horror. Balsams explained that since they were already targeting him, this was his only way to survive. Oscar asked, "Life without magic isn't just magic. If he takes a closer look, he'll notice that many live happily without it. As long as he's alive, he can find his happiness. He's young and shouldn't miss his chance." Oscar replied no, he was confident and said there was no way he could back out now. Balsams asked, "What did that mean?" Oscar thanked him for his concern, but if those targeting him were at the academy, he had an idea. Balsams asked, surprised, "What was that idea?" Oscar replied that he would act as bait and lure them out. At that moment, Balsams was stunned and unsure how to react. He asked, "Isn't he afraid of dying?" Oscar replied that he wasn't planning on dying yet and smiled. At that moment, Balsams grinned and suddenly burst into loud laughter. Oscar looked at him, stunned, and Balsams apologized, saying that in that case, he could only respond to his determination. He offered his hand, and Oscar shook it with a smile. Balsams asked, "But before rushing into battle, it wouldn't hurt to find a new wand." Oscar thought about it and took out his broken wand, realizing it was all cracked. Sometime later, in the bookstore, Isabel told him it was a beginner's wand, just right for him. The protagonist didn't understand what a wand was for. She replied that writing with a finger was difficult. Didn't he agree? Let him imagine that mana was ink and the wand was a quill. He could certainly get by without it, but then he'd never be able to cast a perfect spell, so he had to choose his tool wisely. Oscar examined his wand and thought about how he'd never even considered that it could break. Had he invested too much mana back then? At that moment, someone called his name. It was Lily, the one who'd kept him waiting. He replied that he should be the one apologizing, since he'd taken her out on her day off. Lily said no, she needed to buy a few things herself, so she was glad to see him, and embarrassed, said they'd go buy him a new wand. After a while, they went into a store, and the protagonist was surprised by how many options there were. The salesperson said he was proud of his selection, and he should take a look. This wand was encrusted with precious stones, a one-of-a-kind piece, so he'd definitely stand out. He asked again, "Do the stones have any effect?" Lily whispered to him to look at the price, and when the main character saw that it cost 1 million, Lily suggested looking at what was available in other stores, since they couldn't afford it. So, The guys ran away from every store they came across, since everything was too expensive, and the salespeople were pushing them around. When they were free and went outside, Oscar sighed sadly, noticing that wands were so expensive, he didn't have enough money, even for the cheapest one. Most wizards were aristocrats. They prioritized the beauty of a wand, hence the prices. He was surprised and said that things had dragged on, and perhaps he would go on alone. Lily replied, no, they had started together and would finish together. After a while, Oscar looked at the shops and suggested that they seemed to sell wands there too. A guy passing by decided to advise them not to go in. Oscar asked again, but why? He replied that the place had a terrible reputation and the owner made people buy things they didn't need. Oscar thought about it, meaning something they didn't need. Lily grabbed his sleeve and told him not to go in there. She could bet they wouldn't let him out until he bought something. He went inside anyway, saying he had nothing to lose. When he found himself in the room, it was very dark and there were a lot of weapons around. Lily followed him into the room but was terrified. They heard strange sounds and discovered a salesperson who asked if they were customers or just looking around. Oscar replied that he needed a new wand and wanted to buy it. At that moment, the salesperson turned around and said they'd come to him specifically for that reason. The city was full of shops with wands suitable for children like them. Oscar looked at him confidently and their gazes locked. The man then threw a sharp blade at him and screamed, "Is he kidding me?" The protagonist managed to dodge the blow, and Lily looked in fear at the knife stuck in the wall. Oscar said he hadn't even intended to do that, and the salesperson yelled at him to shut up, saying his shop didn't carry wands for swordsmen. At that moment, Oscar froze, and Lily didn't understand what he was talking about. She didn't like it here and suggested they leave quickly. She was terrified, and Oscar replied no, he would buy the wand right there and he liked the shop. He smiled and looked at the salesperson. Lily, dumbfounded, asked again, "Will he buy a wand here?" Oscar asked. What made him think he was a swordsman? The salesman glanced at him, his hands, clothes, and shoes. He said his center of gravity was slightly off to the right, which usually happens when someone constantly wears something on their left hip, like a sword. The protagonist realized what was going on, and Lily shouted that he wasn't a swordsman, but Oscar realized it only took him a second to see right through him, and he said the situation was indeed grave. An awkward silence ensued, and the salesman asked if he'd started studying magic 6 months ago. Oscar replied that he'd been learning fencing from his father since childhood, and old habits had stuck with him. Lily decided to stand up for him and said that Oscar and she were studying at the Magic Academy. The salesman scratched his nose and asked, "So what?" He says he needs a wand. Oscar replied that the one he'd been using was still broken. He handed it to the seller, who said it was beyond repair, and the magic circle inside was damaged. Apparently, the wand couldn't handle the strain due to the excessive amount of mana. Oscar asked, "How come?" He replied that the larger the wand, the more mana it can withstand. Advanced wands are more difficult to handle and require precise mana control. This wand is for beginners and can withstand very little mana, but it's easy to handle. He's seen the fancy staves the academy teachers carry, right? So beginner's wand can't handle the amount of mana he's putting into the spell. In that case, which wand would be best for him? The seller replied that he hadn't yet decided whether he would sell him anything. Oscar was surprised by this reaction, and the seller asked him to try to choose the best wand from those available. If he made the right choice, he would sell it to him. He pointed to a rack of wands, and the protagonist began examining each one. Lily watched intently, mulling over the fact that a wand's price depended on its size and the materials used. A wand made of rare, conductive materials could fetch a fortune. At that moment, Oscar looked up and realized it was wood. Could it really be pine needles? The money from selling this wood would be enough to live in luxury for a year. She asked Oscar to look at it, and he replied that he had chosen it. He picked up a regular-looking wand and said it was what he needed. Lily was stunned by what she saw, because in her opinion, it wasn't what he needed at all, and the most expensive wand in the store was right there on top. Oscar replied that he should have chosen the best pack, not the most expensive. Lily was surprised, and the salesperson asked, "Dude, why did you choose this particular wand?" He replied that it exuded warmth. The salesperson said it was just an old wand, and Oscar confirmed that it was still intact. Losing a weapon is the worst thing that can happen in the heat of battle, and of course the wand looks battered, but it works as it should. The craftsman clearly poured his heart and soul into it. The seller was stunned by what he heard, and at that moment Oscar asked, "Will he sell it to him?" The seller took the wand and replied that it was the one he made long ago for his son, and it wasn't for sale. Lily asked, "So what's it doing here?" The wand had outlived its owner, and that often happens. In any case, this old wand couldn't be called good, and at that moment, an awkward silence ensued between them. Lily said they should leave and keep looking for a good wand. Oscar replied that he was sorry, but nothing could be done about it. The seller, without turning around, asked where they were going. Oscar turned around, confused. He told them to wait there, because he would bring a good wand. Oscar and Lily were overjoyed by this, and she admitted she'd been very worried. Oscar apologized and asked, wasn't she curious to know what kind of wand he would bring? She replied that he wasn't such a bad person after all, and just as the doors opened, Iman walked in. Iman was stunned and asked what they were doing there. The guys turned around, frightened, unsure how to react. Iman was angry and holding a rope in his hands. The protagonist noticed this, and Lily asked, "Professor, did he come for the wand too?" He replied something like that. At that moment, the clerk approached and greeted Lord Iman, who said his name Rod, and said that he saw he was busy, then he would leave. At that moment, he ran out of the store and headed back. Lily watched him go and said that he had left, but she wondered why he had come here. The protagonist responded to this situation with silence, and Rod said that he couldn't sit still. He handed the wand to Oscar and said that it was his new partner. The wand was enormous, and he realized what it was. The source tree is a great tree towering on an island. Despite the harsh conditions, this plant managed to survive, and its green leaves never wither. Since it sheds its branches for several decades, wands made from the branches of this tree are considered the finest and incredibly valuable. The seller said that the mist was telling the truth, and that the wand's mana conductivity was simply excellent. Oscar asked sheepishly, "Is it that valuable?" Lily said they probably couldn't afford such a high price and became embarrassed. The seller said he was planning to give it to his son when he returned from the war and had no intention of selling it, so he wouldn't take any money from them. He silently handed over the wand and said he wouldn't sell him any other wands. There was no other wand or staff in this shop that would suit him better than this one. The protagonist was delighted and thanked the gentleman for such a gesture. He waved and told him to try it out. When Oscar looked at the wand, he tapped it on the ground and closed his eyes, when suddenly magic appeared around it. He watched closely and felt a strange sensation. It felt so familiar in his hands. He will use this for the rest of his life. Rod rudely said that if they had no more business here, they should leave. He still had other customers to serve. Oscar came to his senses and asked, "By the way, does Professor Iman come here often?" Rod was stunned and didn't know what to say. After a while, the students gathered in the classroom and took their seats. They began discussing how they had ended up in the 5th high school training ground. Apparently, the teleportation circle hadn't been fixed. Everyone looked at Oscar and Lily, who were sitting together, and the boys discussed how lucky they were to be unharmed. People were saying that Raven tried to escape alone, which made them laugh. And at that moment, a teacher entered the room. It was Iman who shouted that chatting in class is a clear sign of disrespect. Students shouted apologies, and when Iman sat down, he watched him closely. At that moment, he remembered Rod's words from the shop, who had said that Lord Iman was the commander of the unit in which his son served. He had seen his son die on the battlefield. When he learned of this, Iman brought his wand, all that remained of his son. He kept it for himself. Lily asked how that was possible. He replied that she might be an aristocrat, but he had always treated his commoner son well. He was a good man. At that moment, Oscar tensed up and said it was a good wand. His son was a very talented magician, right? So he was on par with aristocrats. At that moment, the seller tensed up and asked how he knew that. Meanwhile, the protagonist watched Iman's actions and reflected that Professor Iman had been one of the observers that day and was certain that he had organized the attack. He didn't know that he had figured it all out, and this was his chance. This time, he would make the first move. After some time, Iman entered his room and looked into a magic mirror with a demon who said that they highly valued the skills he had demonstrated on the battlefield, and they sent him to the academy to continue his duties. Iman replied that he understood everything, and the stranger said the academy was too much for him compared to the front. Iman insisted that this wasn't true, and the demon told him to hurry and carry out his orders. The Lord didn't know what to do and remained silent. When a new day dawned, the protagonist told the principal that Iman had organized the attack. He simply couldn't believe it, as he was ready to risk his life for his comrades. He was a brave mage. Oscar replied that he had heard about his past and was completely confident in his conclusion. If so, he couldn't doubt it, but they couldn't arrest him without proof. Oscar replied that that was why he was there and smiled. The principal looked at him questioningly, and Oscar said that he had tried to kill him during the very first practical lesson and needed it to look like an accident to avoid unnecessary witnesses. If they gave him such a chance, he would immediately take it. The principal was dumbfounded and realized that to avoid unnecessary witnesses, he would request an escort for the princess. Her Highness Ariel was originally supposed to enroll with the other students, but the magic passed down through the imperial family affected her health, and enrollment was postponed. Rush announced that he needed to go to the capital to meet Her Highness and accompany her. Oscar had been assigned to this mission. When Zazan heard his name, he was upset. Oscar thought about the journey from the academy to the capital and realized that for the games, this would definitely be an excellent opportunity to attack him. Rush asked if there were any questions left. Zazan raised his hand and said that if he was invited here, did that mean they considered his skills on par with theirs? Rush answered affirmatively, as he had performed admirably in the last practical lesson. She would say he had already surpassed them. When Zazan heard these words, his face twisted in horror, and the girl sitting next to him showed surprise, clearly uneasy. Zazan replied that he knew he barely had enough mana for a lower-class class and could only use basic spells. He was a mere, insignificant commoner. Oscar, hearing the insults directed at him, didn't know how to respond, And Zazan continued to say that time after time, people appeared who praised him to the skies. And now she was saying he had surpassed him? It would be strange, no matter how you look at it, and so he challenged him to a duel. Zazan pointed his finger at him and shouted to show him everything he could as a mage. Oscar was dumbfounded with horror and asked, "What?" Rush clutched her face and said she felt like a routine escort mission would descend into complete chaos under these circumstances. "Okay then," she said, "the losers of the duel will be suspended from missions." Zazan replied that this was exactly what he wanted. Oscar reacted in surprise and didn't know what to do. After a while, they found themselves dueling opposite each other. Oscar couldn't understand how it had all come to this and grabbed his staff, then tensed when he saw Zazan raise his hand. At that moment, ice shards appeared around his body, and Zazan shouted at him to defend himself immediately. Oscar looked up and realized that if he wanted to deal with Iman, he simply had to participate in this mission. So he grabbed his staff and decided that everything would go as he, Zazan, wished. He pointed his staff in his direction, he was sure. Once in the past, in Zazan's memories, many guys used the dummy to inflict damage on it with magical powers. All the projectiles hit. What else would you expect from the son of the Gloris family? Zazan looked at the dummy, which had shattered into tiny pieces, and his face twisted in horror. House Gloris is a family of aristocrats specializing in ice magic. Compared to his older brother, who lived up to everyone's expectations, he was once again born without magical talent. His entire body froze as he honed his skills day after day. He needed to catch up with his brother and live up to his parents' expectations, and most importantly, to become a worthy member of House Gloris. All these thoughts flashed before him during the battle, and he used an ice spear and struck the protagonist. He was dumbfounded with horror and tensed, then decided to dodge. Zazan shouted that he was excellent at dodging, but what would he say to that? He immediately cast the global icing spell Megastorm. The protagonist realized that ice was forming on his hands and face. His hand was very cold, so he used Photius's fire to rid himself of the ice. At that moment, Zazan was surprised and stopped. Oscar looked him confidently in the eyes while Rush continued to watch the battle unfold. He uses fire to negate spells and has extensive combat experience, but there's a huge difference in their mana pools, and Oscar can easily be overwhelmed by the sheer volume of spells he casts. Zazan admitted that for a commoner, he possessed incredible magical talent, but at that moment, he cast a magical seal over himself and shouted that he hadn't trained so hard just to lose to some newbie. The girl sitting across from him, reading a book, usually ignored them. But at that moment, even she looked up from her book and became absorbed in their fight. Rush exclaimed, "What the hell is that?" The protagonist glowed with magic and apologized for keeping them waiting. It had taken longer to prepare than he'd expected. Zazan asked what that meant. Oscar replied that it was his turn. He smiled, but Zazan shouted that it was too late and then shouted, "Ice Prison Weather Sphere." The protagonist was dumbfounded and realized it was a spear barrage, and he was using camouflage to cast a more powerful spell. But he had already finished strengthening his mana, and at that moment, a huge block of ice appeared in front of his face. He realized that with his new staff, he should succeed, so he used the fire blade and, a moment later, easily smashed the ice block. Zazan's mouth dropped open in shock, as did Rush and the student. His body felt so light, and he moved exactly as he wanted. He saw how magic formulas activated in a chain reaction. There were no malfunctions, no delays. How fun it was. Zazan realized that he had destroyed his protective spell and screamed that it was impossible. He fell to his knees, shocked, and didn't know how to react. He recalled his childhood and asked, "How can I become like my older brother?" He replied that he was overestimating him because he wasn't that good a mage. There were talents in this world that would make him seem like a speck of dust, and when he saw Oscar in front of him, he knew it was him. And Rush screamed that that was enough. The fight was over. Meanwhile, Raven jumped up and started screaming in anger. He didn't understand why he had to go through this. Everyone started talking about him, and he screamed that it was all Oscar's fault. At that moment, he turned around and heard a knock. When he looked out the door, he asked, "Who else is there at this hour?" Suddenly, he was horrified and realized it was Professor Iman standing in front of him. After a while, the guys gathered in the classroom, and the protagonist noticed Zazan enter with his friends. He glared at him and remembered what he had said after the fight, that it was unfair. He had trained since childhood, and talent alone was enough for him to overtake him. The protagonist offered him his hand, but Zazan jumped up and shouted that he would definitely beat him, no matter how long it took. He smiled as he remembered this and realized that he, too, was not going to stand still, so he needed to deal with Iman tomorrow. After a while, Rush entered the classroom and announced that they would conduct another mana assessment before the start of class. When Raven entered, he silently passed her, and she said that he was late today. All the guys began to discuss how he was so afraid for himself that he was afraid to even leave the dorm. Everyone wanted to joke and tease him, but he didn't know what to do. He sat down near Oscar, who noticed him and wondered what was wrong with his hand. Rush yelled at everyone to be quiet, as they were about to be evaluated. When the lesson ended, the students left the room, and Lily discussed how his mana had increased again. Oscar replied that he was already starting to get used to the staff, and Lily suggested that maybe she needed to buy a new wand too. At that moment, Raven caught up with them and addressed Oscar. He turned around and wondered what he wanted from him, and Raven said, "Let him tell him how to become stronger." Oscar asked again, what was he talking about? Raven shouted, "Don't make a fool of yourself. He wants to know his secret." Oscar was surprised and asked himself, what does secret even mean? When they found themselves on the battlefield that night, Oscar said he was well prepared and even found a place to practice. But what secret are we talking about? Raven asked again. Isn't it obvious? He was talking about the power he used against the dragon. Raven asked. Someone helped him too, didn't they? Oscar had no idea what they were talking about and kept asking him again. Raven gritted his teeth in anger and started screaming. How much longer was he going to keep up this act? Was he an idiot to them all? At that moment, a bright light began to leak from his hand and he began to transform into a monster. Oscar was as horrified by this sight as Raven himself, and they both started screaming. What is this? Oscar asked. Is he okay? Raven screamed that he didn't know that because he hadn't told him about it. At that moment, he cried out in horror and fear, and everything around him began to glow with magical light, and many fragments appeared on the battlefield. Oscar tried to get back and realized that someone was controlling his hand. At that moment, he remembered his words and realized that it could really be Emon. Raven screamed, is it his fault? What's wrong with at least trying to survive himself? He really wanted to protect everyone. Oscar realized what was happening and rushed into battle. He moved from Raven's hand and began the battle. Raven didn't understand what was happening and screamed in terror, and a moment later, they both fell to the ground. The protagonist placed Raven on the ground and asked Emon, is he ready to go this far? Why was he playing with people's lives? Let him show you right now, Emon, and come out here. At that moment, a multitude of birds appeared above him, among them Emon, who said he had no upbringing, a commoner. When the protagonist saw him, Emon announced that a tragic accident would occur here today. The students were training after class, and one of them's powers had gotten out of control. This sad story, a young talent lost forever. At that moment, he created a fiery flash of light and decided to throw it at Oscar, whom he considered a barbarian. It would force him to his knees. Oscar tensed and prepared for battle, when suddenly a multitude of magical beasts appeared around him. The wolves began to scream and attack him, and Oscar tried to retreat, thinking about how he was a summoner mage and that Emon was placing magical marks on monster corpses and manipulating them like puppets. But he could only summon a limited number of familiars, so he only had one practice session. The rector had told him all this, and he realized he needed to forget about the mage and deal with the monsters first. He was at the level of a magic emperor. Perhaps he had a few trump cards sealed away, so he shouldn't try to fight him alone. Oscar thought he knew about this. That's what he was planning to do. But he turned to Raven and remembered his words about how he truly wanted to protect everyone, tears in his eyes. This distracted him, and, enraged, he destroyed the first wolf. Emon asked why he was so angry. Was it because of his past with Ravon? Oscar asked again. What if that was it? Emon replied that they could hardly be considered acquaintances. They had only crossed paths in practice. Oscar replied that this was more than enough, and Emon said that Raven wasn't like that. He needed strength to defeat him. While Raven lay unconscious, he continued to say that he was a commoner and nothing more than an obstacle to him. The protagonist asked again, what's wrong with that? Emon hesitated, and Oscar said that whatever the reason, he had decided to become stronger, and he had decided to take advantage of it, and he would not forgive that. At that moment, he cast a spell on his staff and suddenly shattered it into tiny pieces. He realized he couldn't create a magic formula, and Emon said that talented commoners had no right to exist. He landed next to him and said that no one recognized his talent, and therefore he had prepared thoroughly. At that moment, a huge beast resembling an elephant with a huge tentacled trunk appeared in front of him. Oscar didn't know what to do and was dumbfounded. This creature was absorbing his mana and preventing him from casting the spell. Emon asked, does he think he didn't have a plan? He knew what he was capable of, didn't he? At that moment, Oscar was surrounded by several more wolf monsters, who growled in his face and said that neither he nor he himself could use magic anymore. But the spell he had set beforehand would continue to work. He could take these spells with him to the next world after finishing his last lesson. Oscar spoke up. He'd always wondered why all the talented mages had lost to him, but now he understood. They were afraid, and they were left without magic, surrounded by monsters. And he, too, wanted to teach him one special lesson. With these words, he burst into battle. One day, while the rector was sitting in his office, Rush entered, knocked on the door, and said he needed to check his documents. And what about tomorrow's mission? Balsams grinned and replied that nothing could happen to Her Highness, but they wouldn't talk about it. There were many applications for the training grounds this year. Rush replied that there were many ambitious students. Speaking of which, it seems Professor Emon has taken up private tutoring with Raven. At that moment, the rector tensed and asked again, Emon? The protagonist was left completely alone in front of the Lord, and the monsters immediately rushed at him. He realized that, while this familiar was there, he wouldn't be able to activate any new spells, but the summoning magic was still active, meaning there must be a loophole that allowed him to cast spells. He turned around and saw the monster already attacking him, which frightened him greatly, and a moment later, the monster almost ate him. Emon decided that one less threat was in store for him, as he thought he was finished, but the monster grabbed the protagonist's hands, and he threw the creature aside with a bright mog of flame. When the monster began to burn, Emon screamed that it was impossible. How could he use magic? He noticed that the magic circle was inside the familiar's body, meaning that as long as the circle didn't come into contact with air, the magic worked. He pulled it out with his bloodied hand, and Imon asked how he had noticed the formulas inside the body. What kind of nonsense was this? What about the staff? The familiar's mouth only fit his hand. He replied that magic could be used without a staff. When Imon realized he was using his fingers to cast the spell, he was shocked. Oscar spoke up. So, he's gotten rid of his trumps. Will there be more familiars? Imon released 2 magic circles and shouted, "Does he think he's already won?" A moment later, he directed his powers toward the enemy, and Oscar shouted, "Fireblade." With this spell, he destroyed his opponent's spell, and Imon shouted that even without familiars, he was still at the level of an emperor. Had he really penetrated his shield? He deliberately held back, not wanting his friend to think he'd worked twice. And Oscar said that wasn't necessary. At that moment, it turned out that his staff had been smashed into small pieces. Eamon was left speechless. Alex asked, how much can he do without his staff? Eamon fell to the ground and shouted at him to stop. He wouldn't bother him anymore, and would tell him everything he wanted to know. That's right, he'd give him a recommendation to become a magical apprentice, and he could become a full-fledged mage. Oscar asked, is that all he wanted to say? He shouldn't worry. He wouldn't kill him, but he still needed the information. At that moment, Amon jumped up and shouted that he should surrender immediately. But then someone called out to him, don't get cocky, you commoner. He tore off his mask, and a completely different monster appeared before Oscar. The protagonist was stunned when he saw this, and suddenly the monster began to disintegrate into tiny pieces. As this happened, he began to wonder if he had used his own body to create a familiar, but at that moment, the monster began to roar loudly and destroy everything around him. Oscar realized he had completely lost his mind and wanted to capture him alive. Suddenly, someone cast a storm pressure spell, and everything around him glowed with a bright light. Rector Balsams himself arrived to his aid, telling him that he was a good man for holding out so long. He would deal with him from now on.